welcome to our April 2018 DT Turfgrass Tuesday. I'm Mike Goetling. Beside me is Dr. Sean Askew and Mr. John Brewer. This is Weed Control in Low Input Turf.
All right, we're talking about management strategies for low maintenance turf. So there's been a huge increase in low maintenance areas, I'd say, in the past 10 years or so, especially following the 2008 economic recession that hit the housing market in particular, which is closely tied to the turfgrass industry. So ever since then, the rise in really scrutinizing what part of our facilities need to be managed turf and what part doesn't. This has affected the golf industry, parks and rec across the board. And there's also been an increase in public awareness of the environment in general and of kind of a need for reduced inputs in the management of turfgrass areas. So we certainly get a lot of questions about this particular area. And so a lot of the technological advances have occurred in the golf area. And it turns out it's quite difficult to establish native grasses, which is what everyone wants to do. And what we end up utilizing most often for these areas is huge components of fine leaf fescues with certain mixtures that might include other native grasses as well. And these have been employed very successfully on a number of golf course locations. What are the benefits of low maintenance? Well, it costs less. It's easier on the environment. It's easier on you. It takes less time and effort once the system is established. Less water, all of those things that are required to keep ornamental turfgrass healthy and looking good, those things increase the more stress we apply to the turf. And so the shorter the mowing height and the more, for example, athletic wear the turf is going to experience, the more inputs we need. We need fungicide, we need herbicides. If you thin the turf, that's why we get weeds. They find a hole, they punch through. You got to spray a herbicide or do something. Fertilize. If the plant is continuously being stressed and having to respond to that stress, it uses more energy reserves and you need to replace those energy reserves. So the whole concept of low maintenance is to manage the turf in such a way that we reduce the requirement for the inputs in the first place. So we have to choose types of turf that respond to that type of management, and then we have to treat them in the way that's going to be most conducive for that system to be successful.
Well, these low maintenance turf areas also allow for golf courses to have a better, or people to have a better public view of what golf courses are, because a lot of times people think they're wasteful and not environmentally sound. And in many cases, these naturalized areas are bringing in wildlife, helping the environment, and in many cases are changing the overall perception to actually having significant environmental benefits and not negative impacts. So that's kind of a real push for native areas, pollinator gardens, and so on and so forth for golf courses and other turf areas as well.
A lot of times in the inner city, at least, golf courses are some of the best urban environment there is. Bird watching trails, all these sorts of things lend very well to the golf course environment. In fact, despite public perception, golf courses actually are one of the most cleanly managed systems in agriculture as a whole. Most of the research has been done looking, for example, at water quality. The water quality is cleaner leaving a golf course than it is entering. And most people would think that that's a ridiculous statement. How could that be true with all of the different pesticides and things that are used on golf courses? But if used in a very technically savvy way, as golf courses do, very trained and experienced people, following label instructions, not using dangerous products near waterways, and then managing healthy turfgrass, which is one of our best environmental filters, yes, the water is much cleaner leaving the golf course than it is entering.
So since we have all these benefits of lower inputs and better environmental and more environmental benefits, what are the negatives of low maintenance turf? And that comes to weed pressure. The less we maintain it, the more stress that then might occur because we're not maintaining it as much, not as much fertilizer, not as much water. Start to have weed encroachment of different grasses like Japanese stiltgrass and deer tongue grass, annuals and perennial type of grasses, and also broadleaves, especially hard to control broadleaves like your blackberry species, black raspberry, your rubus species, Pennsylvania blackberry, black raspberry, dewberry. That's just a few of the weeds that we see in these low maintenance turf
pick up a lot of weird stuff that you don't often see in the more managed turf. And this becomes a challenge because some of these species aren't on the herbicide labels, and some of them we don't really have technology worked out to control them. So we get questions oftentimes from reduced management areas, and there aren't good solutions. Sometimes there aren't any legal solutions for controlling them with selective chemicals. So the whole deal with low maintenance is trying to figure out an ecology that gives you the aesthetic that you're looking for, as well as the functionality that you're looking for. If you're trying to maintain a native grass meadow at about knee to waist high, and you've got these plants that are growing head high, or blackberry or trees and things like that, then that can become extremely labor intensive to deal with. In fact, many of the golf course patrons that we've worked with indicate that they're spending as much or more time on trying to manage weeds in low maintenance areas, and yet the concept was supposed to be low maintenance. They're not supposed to be out there working in these areas, and yet it does become a problem.
And so this kind of, when you get this kind of weed pressures, it causes more maintenance issues when you're trying to mow and maintain a good quality.
These areas aren't easy to maintain.
No, they're not.
Usually the area you would want to be low maintenance is out of the way or hard to manage. Those are two very excellent reasons to adopt a low maintenance strategy. And so thus, if it's hard to manage, there's a reason for that. And as you can see in this image, you're risking life and limb just to mow the area.
And then finally, when it comes to golf courses, and specifically, it makes it more harder for play and slows down play and causes a lot of problems to members. But for other aspects of low maintenance turf, it also can cause visual problems as well, and also just enjoying the area you have. So next, what's the first step in a good weed control program or management strategy for these low maintenance areas? And that's choosing the right turf grass species. You may be able to talk more on this picture.
Well, yeah, it all depends on what you want. Most people who go into this have a mindset that they want this pristine native meadow that I did or did not. Virginia, when you think about our late succession flora, it's going to be mostly forested. And if it's not forested, it's going to be swamp. And so trying to replicate a meadow that may have been native to some other area of the country using grasses that are native, could be found in Virginia, sometimes it doesn't work. Those things tend to evolve slowly over time in areas where they're extremely adapted to the exclusion through competition of other plant species. Well, if you're in an area that does not give a competitive advantage to the native grasses you're trying to grow, you're going to have a serious challenge trying to keep unwanted plants out of that system. So, as John mentioned, one way to address that is pick species for your meadow that are going to be more aggressive, more competitive, or more able to exclude those weeds that you don't want. Here in this slide, we're showing an example of finely fescue on the left and blue gramagrass on the right. Now, these were established at the Turfgrass Research Center at Virginia Tech, and they were both seeded at the exact same time and managed in the exact same way, and neither of them have ever seen a herbicide, at least on this particular plot. And we're looking at it a couple years out, and you can see the speed of establishment and overall competitiveness of the finely fescue in terms of weed suppression has been superior to that of blue gramagrass in this particular example. And so incorporating finely fescues into these mixtures has become kind of an industry standard. It may not be what is most desirable. So just realize that if what you want is a specific mixture of native grasses, that's probably going to require a lot more sweat equity on your part to keep the weeds out, hand pulling and things like that. And I mean, how would we manage that blue gramagrass there on the right? Probably one of the easiest ways for a homeowner to do that would be to wait till after a good drenching rain and then go out and hand pull those weeds. Sometimes tools may be required for woody species, but for most of those, that's fireweed, horseweed, things like that. They should hand pull fairly easily. At that late stage, a herbicide is not recommended. So you're either going to manage those weeds before they occur with herbicides, or you're going to come out and manage them with good old organic hand pulling.
And so these are just some of the species, the fine fescue species that we have. And since I guess we typically do recommend fine fescue. Hard fescue and sheep's fescue tend to be the ones that seem to have the best competition and work the best in these areas. And this here is just an example from Dr. Dernoden looking at hard fescue and sheep's fescue having the best quality and best weed control when compared to other fescues or fine fescue species. And also better quality.
Dr. Dernoden is a retired professor from the University of Maryland. And this work was actually, as indicated on the title, they're done in Maryland. So, is that all you want to say about
I just wanted to show. And again, here just showing the quality of hard fescue versus your thermal blue and a tall fescue combo on the right. Fine fescue looks really good, even with those seed heads, looks really native and looks really nice. And when you're having 1 or 2 mowings a year, it keeps that pretty good quality and good density. Sometimes the density of these can be a problem if you're talking about golf courses because recently, like at Aaron Hills at the U.S. Open, I believe last year, they had a lot of issue with professional golfers complaining because it was so thick, which is great for weed control, but obviously for when it comes to playability, it can be difficult.
That's another thing about hard fescue is that the seed head density. I mean, on this image, it looks like we have a pretty dense seed head population, but that is nothing compared to a chewings type fescue. When chewings go to seed, oftentimes the seed head density is so extreme, the plants will lodge over and flatten out. And so that can be an aesthetic issue there. But you can imagine, one thing that we haven't mentioned, I guess you touched on it briefly, John, in terms of benefits of these native areas. But just think about that managed turf all the way around this plot, and then look at the plot and think about all the animals and insects and other things that can harbor there in that taller height of cut. Mm-hmm. That's a positive for those animals for sure, but it may not be a positive for you if you're trying to grow these types of systems close to homes or businesses and things like that. You're probably going to have an increase in things like mice or other animals. I mean, you're bringing the ecosystem home is what you're doing. And so that could lead to this interaction between humans and animals that wouldn't be desirable, but certainly in the right place, it's an absolutely desirable thing.
And I guess one thing to note there too is, again, if you're choosing this for a home lawn or something around a business, you got to be careful. Fine fescues might not be the best because tendency is that most people mow grasses real low around homes and they're wherever they're employed, and that's not positive for fine fescue or tall fescues. They need to be mowed relatively high. So if you're looking for something that can be mowed short, then you're going to look for a different turf species.
And in that light, another comment: hard fescues are perfect for these systems because they thrive better when they're left alone. And so mowing is one thing that would disfavor that, but also where. Like if you're trying to put these things in an area where people are constantly walking through, A, the people are not going to walk through or want to walk through knee-high grass, and B, the hard fescue is not going to like that very much.
So this is just some recommendations, kind of mixtures and what not to use. Again, you want to stay away from monostands if possible. Monostands can have issue with low genetic variability. You can have issue with disease where that monostand is taken out, but if you have a mixture of different species, you might be able to survive through different stresses and issues. That's just some recommendations potentially to use.
Do these fescues need to be grown in full sun?
We've got a question here. Do these fescues, like fine fescue, hard fescue, sheep's fescue, chewings, do they need to be grown in full sun? They absolutely love full sun, but they're actually one of our most shade-adapted grasses that are available. So no turfgrass is going to enjoy living in deep shade. But the fine fescues rank among the most successful turfgrass types to growing in partial shade when you look at all of the options available. So they're a great choice for semi-wooded, woodland edge, spotty tree type situations where other grasses will thin out. For example, finely fescues will persist much better than tall fescue in a situation like that.
And one thing you'll see later on in this presentation is that a lot of times in the sun, fine fescue has a higher tolerance of certain herbicides than it does in the shade. Potentially, we think potentially due to cuticle density, but you'll see that later on in the presentation.
Yeah, that's something we've seen in a couple of instances, so we'll hit on that more.
So into weed control, again, we specifically want to touch on deer tongue grass, Japanese stoat grass, and blackberry. I'm going to start off with deer tongue grass. We've done a lot of work at Primlin resort. As you see here, this is a picture from there, and it definitely changes the quality of the rough area when it comes to trying to have uniform green turf. But so we'll just go on into.
Before we get into that, John, there's a reason we're picking those species, right?
Yeah.
And that reason is after our normal maintenance programs are done, guess what? These persist. And so let's talk a little bit about that normal maintenance program, which is going to be similar to your ornamental turf, your managed turf grass. Most people are going to use a pre-emerge herbicide. Well, let me back up a little bit. The goal is to not need herbicides. And when properly managed, these types of systems don't. But in most cases, at least in my experience, you're going to have to use herbicides on occasion, or you're going to have to come in with very aggressive hand weeding just to get the grasses established. But that routine maintenance program would be done in the same way as ornamental turf, just not as frequently. And so what we're typically going to do is you may need a pre-emerge herbicide to address annual grasses like crabgrass and goosegrass, things like barricade, dimension, those types. And you're going to need a broad spectrum, broadleaf weed control product to deal with woody vegetation and other small broadleaves that are going to come through the system. And that's going to be things like three-way herbicides that contain 2,4-D, dicamba, MCPP. Example trade names would be Trimix, Speed Zone, things like that. And when those are employed, they take out troublesome weed populations that might pop up from time to time. And once the low maintenance turf is established and we're not mowing and you get that high competition that would come from that, usually weeds are not a problem. But these particular species we're going to talk about today have been extremely troublesome in these systems, and that's why we're focusing on them.
Yeah, and one more thing to note that we haven't specifically said is that typically in these areas, the weeds we see to be issues, it's not Japanese stillgrass specifically, but others, is they're typically perennial types, grasses and broadleaves, which most of the herbicides like pre's and three-ways will not control most of your perennial broadleaves or grasses. So that's why we have difficulty in these areas with that management.
How does this particular grass spread? Is this an aggressive seed producer?
Deer tongue grass?
Deer tongue grass.
It's rhizomatous, so it spreads in that right, kind of like Bermuda grass. It has these creeping rhizomes that run under the soil. So a small patch just gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And certainly if any of that vegetative material gets moved through tillage or any other means, you can scatter this plant all over the place. But it also every year produces copious amounts of seed that get scattered around by wind, water, and wildlife.
And that's one reason why labor can increase in these areas and we want to decrease is because a lot of superintendents will send out crews to specifically wipe these clump of perennial species, grasses or broadleaves with Roundup or other herbicides, which that's going to take a lot more time and a lot more effort to go out there and walk and spot spray or spot treat than just a general broadcast.
And there's one more comment I want to make. You can see in this image how to some people, that deer tongue grass would be a serious aesthetic issue. It all depends on what type of system you're trying to establish and what the overall look that you want is. But deer tongue grass is actually a native perennial grass that's one of the best selections for example, reestablishing strip mining areas. Deer tongue grass has that dense rhizome system that can hold soil banks and things in place, and it's very effective at that, and it's a native species, and so it's not bad in all cases, but certainly in the world, in a situation where you're trying to maintain a uniform meadow for aesthetic reasons, like the fine bladed grasses here. This is a mixture of grama grass, fine leaf fescue, and some others. The deer tongue grass with its wide leaf blade and light green color really stands out. But the bigger problem, and this is on a golf course, the bigger problem is if a golf ball goes into one of those patches, you might as well just take a drop and move on. You are not going to find that golf ball. And even if you do, if you try to advance that golf ball from one of those patches, you'll come out with a bent club. So let's talk a little bit about what we've done on deer tongue grass, because nothing had been done. This is some of the first chemical control research in the world that's been attempted with deer tongue grass. We're not going to talk about this, obviously, but we had this huge greenhouse screen where we looked at all of the different herbicide options that possibly could be an option in these systems. And we identified a few that tended to work better than others. You can see in this case, we're looking at deer tongue grass control. The tall bars are the ones that work better, and this is at 8 weeks after the treatment. So out of these herbicides, the ones that work, we selected a few to go to the field with.
So this is just showing the field sites that we chose at Primland, one that's in the shade and one that's more sunny on the side of a fairway, just giving you kind of a brief look at what those field sites look like.
Yeah, and in hindsight, we found that the one that's right butted up to the edge of those trees, the one on the top left here, actually tended to change the response of our fine leaf fescues to many of the herbicides. And as John had mentioned, we've done some other follow-up experiments, and we do believe that to be based on the fact that when a plant is growing in a shaded environment, it does not produce as much cuticle wax so that it can maximize the amount of light that's coming in, so it can maximize the amount of photosynthesis that can happen in that low light environment. Whereas when it's growing in the sun, the exact opposite is needed. Light is not an issue. I got plenty of that. But moisture loss due to the evaporation from that extreme solar intensity, that's more of a problem. So the plant just piles on cuticle wax in order to have a better control where that moisture is only being lost through the stomata. And so we believe that that has had a huge impact on the amount of herbicide that can absorb into the leaves. When the low light situation with very little cuticle wax, more herbicide moves in, and we do see a lot more fine fescue injury in that system. We'll show.
Yeah, and so in this case, one last note is that your management strategy may change depending on if you're applying in the shade versus applying in the sun. So that's one thing to make sure you're cautious of when you.
In most cases, honestly, it eventually probably will, or if there's an alternative that's better, knowing that increased turf injury is there. But in most situations with these types of plants we're going to be talking about today, they've already created a very nasty monostand that you could just about go over the top with Roundup and have about the same result. When you kill all the weeds, there's nothing left, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, but anyway, here's the injury from those field trials that we saw. It was a blend, I believe, at Primland Resort. It was a combination of hard fescue and chewing fescue. So we can't really say which fescue was where, but anyway, Roundup caused extreme.
I would note the two sites here.
Yeah, I would. So the R up, the first one on the bottom on the far left, that's Roundup, and the yellow bar is trial 1, the shaded trial, and the orange bar is trial 2, the one in full sun. And look at the difference in fine fescue injury. Almost complete death of fine fescue in the shade from the Roundup, and commercially acceptable levels of a little bit of discoloration out there in the full sun. When we look at the second one, which was Roundup plus, help me out, John, that was Plateau?
Plateau.
Yeah, same thing, extreme injury in the shade, almost no injury in the sun. We didn't have a problem. The next two, ORN1 and ORN3, are Ornamec, which also is a very commonly available herbicide. And no injury there, nor from Pylex. PYL is Pylex, a new product released in 2013 from BASF. Then we have Plateau by itself. Plateau, if you've done any native grass work, you'll know that that product is heavily marketed to that industry. It's good for releasing native grasses during establishment, trying to keep the weeds out. It did cause a little bit of fine leaf fescue injury. Again, a little bit more in the shade than in the sun, but both of them, bordering on commercially acceptable there. And the last one is something we were playing around with. It's not registered in cool season turf, including fine fescues. So this is more of an experimental from this standpoint. The product name is Celsius. It's a product that's used in southern grasses like Bermuda grass for the purposes of both broadleaf and grass control. And it also caused a considerable amount of fine leaf fescue injury there. And this, Plateau is not registered for use in regular ornamental turf. And Celsius being not registered also, that's why those two are giving us that type of injury that we didn't see.
And one final thing to note here, you can go on the next slide. Ornamec is not labeled, it's labeled in turf, it's labeled in tall fescue and zoysia for Bermuda grass control, but not in fine fescue. But fusilade is the same active And Fusillade 2 is labeled in Georgia grass, fine fescue, and tall fescue now.
And we were just discussing that on the way over here. I believe that is a recent addition to the Fusillade label, and I have also been in contact with folks from PBI Gordon Corporation, which makes Ornamec, and they have indicated they're also going to try to add Ornamec, add fine fescue to the Ornamec label, partly as a result of the research we've been doing here at Virginia Tech. Now, these injury responses that we've moved to a new slide, this is at 9 weeks after treatment. Same trends are still occurring. Now looking at deer tongue grass control. Now remember, these are the herbicides that we chose from that huge list that was in the greenhouse trial, and yeah, they're working pretty good. Ornamec was applied once or 3 times, and you can see that it was doing a pretty good job. And you think about, remember back to the injury, there was no injury from Ornamec, so we came out of this deciding that Ornamec or fluazepop, the Fusillade or Ornamec, if Ornamec gets registered, is going to be our best option, with Roundup probably being the second best in full sun. Here's just a few images showing untreated check here, and then we're looking at Roundup. Yeah. I can't see what the labels are because I've got all these little chat boxes that come with our webinar software. But anyway, that's Roundup.
You can see how great control but a lot of injuries.
Yeah, a lot of, look at the dark, this is, I backed up to the Roundup again. The dark green in the upper right is our desirable fine fescue. We've taken out the deer tongue grass, but we've taken out the fine fescue as well. And Mazurpic also giving us a significant injury. That fine fescue, most of it's going to recover, but it was severely injured, but pretty good deer tongue grass control. And here's the combination of Roundup. Okay, I have lost. There we go. All right, now we're looking at fluazepop, which is again Fusillade or Ornamec, and doing a pretty good job there at 6 weeks after treatment. You can see the type of symptoms on the deer tongue grass. Supremazole is Pilex. We're stunting, but not necessarily controlling the deer tongue grass in that case. And here's Plateau or a Mazurpic.
This is by itself and not with glyphosate, just to clear that up.
So not controlling it like it did with the glyphosate, but not as much turf injury either. But severe stunning of the deer tongue grass, a lot less seed production is going to occur there. We're giving a little bit of competitive advantage back to the fine leaf fescue. So a product like Plateau would be used repeatedly over years if we were going to do that. Still, and here we're looking at Celsius, which also not labeled. So again, Ornamec was our recommendation. Even though it didn't give us the absolute best control, it gave us pretty darn good control. With,
so our recommendation at this point would be actually Fusillade, since that's what's labeled in fine fescue.
That's the first one that's labeled.
What would be the rate that you would that be around 20 ounces per acre? It depends.
There's so many different formulations of Fusillade. I would say look at the label rate, because one product has a different concentration in the jug than another. So if I tell you how many ounces per acre, you might get the wrong product. So.
And Fusillade can be used more than just, it can be used for all different perennial grass species. It can be used for Bermuda grass control or bent grass, any type of perennial grass species. At least most of them it has pretty good activity on. It just might take multiple applications, multiple years. But then you have to be careful with injury if you use it too much. So just, but that's just a note to make. But next is on to Japanese stillgrass control.
We have a statement that Celsius kills Virginia buttonweed.
Yes, it does. Statement that Celsius kills Virginia buttonweed. Yes, it does. That's going to be in Bermuda grass or zoysia grass system, some type of southern grass. You can use Celsius in centipede grass, and it is a pretty good broadleaf control. That's how it's being marketed in the deep south. It also has activity. The active ingredient thiocarbazole that's in that product has quite a bit of activity on Dallas grass, which is a hardened perennial with large rhizomes, kind of similar to deer tongue, and that was one of the reasons that we decided to include it in our greenhouse trials, and what you know, it worked fairly well on the deer tongue grass in the greenhouse. That's why it went to the field there, but it's not registered in any cool season grasses, but it is a good product if you have warm season grasses. So we're about halfway through, John. Is that about right for the PowerPoint presentation you've created, or am I going to have to sing songs at the end?
This is the second weed, so we have one more weed after this.
We're doing.
Yeah, so we're doing all right.
Sounds like I might have to sing some songs.
There's a lot. There is a lot in this section.
Okay,
so we can
good.
Speed through it if we need to.
So moving on to Japanese stillgrass. Something you want to say about these?
Well, I've been the main person in the past 3 years or so, putting out a lot of Japanese Turfgrass trials on different lawn sites. And there's
Not to pat your back or anything.
and so there's 4 or 5, 6 different studies we've done, a couple large studies looking at multiple herbicides, some timing studies, and then just other specific herbicides. But we'll go into what we found so far and kind of what recommendation we have for Japanese Turfgrass control in lawns and other areas.
And one of the things that's unique about the work that you've done is that it is in lawns.
Yes.
So most of the Japanese stiltgrass work that has been done has been in forested areas or along wooded roadsides, things like that. And so we continue to get questions about managing Japanese stiltgrass in managed turf. So we're stepping, some of the work that we're talking about has been done in low maintenance areas, but some of it's been done in normal, routinely maintained home lawns. And so we're stepping a little bit outside of the low maintenance topic here, but Japanese stiltgrass is one that you're probably going to encounter in both systems.
And so this is just kind of showing our site 1 in 2014. This was a managed lawn site that was heavily infested with Japanese stiltgrass and a mixture of cool season turf. And this all was it was same landowner, but in a different area, or fescue blend, but again heavily infested with Japanese stiltgrass, and typically mowed weekly or bi-weekly. And this is just another study in the same place, different study that we did for another company. But this is the timing study. This was not an actually managed lawn, but on a roadside, but it was mown probably monthly. The plants are larger, but this was looking at trying to apply early in the year versus late in the year, and which one had the best activity, best control for Japanese stiltgrass. And then sulfentrazone evaluation study looking at which is called typically dismisses what is used. People have told us that there was activity from sulfentrazone, which you'll see that we found a different activity than what people have been telling us. But again, it's on the managed roadside as well.
Well, the thing is about sulfentrazone, and I'm sure you're going to summarize this, is that it causes necrotic burn to the foliage. If you burn like all of the foliage, if the plant's really young and you can get enough coverage to get it all, sometimes you will kill the plants. But what we're seeing is extreme inconsistency.
And that's one thing I will note about the experience I've had with Japanese stiltgrass is, so Japanese stiltgrass is an annual, but as it gets larger, it starts to root at the nodes as the plant starts to fall over, making it a larger plant. And so if you do not catch early, you're typically going to have multiple applications to have significant and consistent control with Japanese stiltgrass. And so this is looking at our large study, looking at, so mesotron is tenacity, tepramazone is pilex, quinclorac is drive, anoxaprop is acclaim, triclopyr, turflawn ester, then a combination of tenacity and turflawn, and pilex and turflawn.
Luckily, there will be a recording of this presentation.
Yeah, so
the
biggest thing to point out here is our phenoxaprop. This was one thing that we really wanted to look at, or acclaim, and we had 3 different rates: a 28 fluid ounce rate, which is the high rate, a 14 fluid ounce rate, which is M for middle, and then the low rate was 7 fluid ounces per acre. And the reason we did this rate response type portion is just because claim is extremely expensive. It's about $200.
That 28 ounce rate is between $180 and $190 just for those 28 ounces.
Yeah.
So if you were to spray 1 acre, it's going to cost you just short of $200. So
yeah,
if we can bring that down to 7 ounces, we will be much more in line with other post-emerge grass herbicides at $50 or less per acre.
And you see that here, the green and blue bars are year 1 and year 2. And you can see in both years, phenoxaprop was consistent, or acclaim was consistent at having very high control, greater than 90%. Tepramazone was number 2, or pilex. And we had a little inconsistency year 1 to year 2. And our belief is that the pilex is we've already seen pilex being inconsistent sometimes in weed control when it comes to environment, like sunlight growth of the plant or moisture levels. And these 2 sites did have a couple different, they had difference in environmental throughout the year. So that could be why we had higher control with pilex in year 2 than we had in year 1. But again, if we had to recommend out of this study, it would be acclaim first and then pilex second. After that, a lot of the other turf herbicides that we would use for grass control really fall off. Quinclorac, which is great for crabgrass or drive, really falls off and has quick activity, but then quickly recovers. And does not have good control.
But the fact that John discovered that you can actually control Japanese stiltgrass very effectively with 1/4 of the labeled rate of Acclaim is a significant discovery because it makes that product an economically viable solution for this problem. And the cool thing about Acclaim is you have to check your label because Acclaim can be used in ornamental beds, it can be used in ornamental turf grass, but Acclaim does not have labeling to go out in the woods. But if you do have any overspray onto adjacent species, anything that's not a true grass, all of your native sedges, ferns, broadleaf plants, you name it, bushes, trees, you can spray right over the top of them without fear of any injury. So it's a great product to target Japanese stiltgrass in the types of environments where it exists, except for when you move out of the managed system and into the woods. At that point, we have to choose a different product, which Segment would be a product of choice. Cefoxidam
and Ornament as well would be effective. So, yes, Segment and Ornament or Fusilier would also be effective options in more naturalized areas. Also, a lot of the pre-emergent herbicides used for crabgrass that can also be used in those areas also are typically pretty effective on Japanese stiltgrass as well.
Yeah, we tend to have, now these are going to be a little more expensive per unit area, and they can't do it alone. We tend to have a lot of organic matter, in a forest understory, and so organic matter binds pre-emergent herbicides that don't work quite as effectively, but we've got some long-term studies in the woods we've been doing with our invasive species ecologist, Dr. Jacob Barney, and we're going into year 8, I think, or year 7 or 8 in that study, and the pre-emergent herbicides are addressing the microsporidium fairly well.
And so this graph here, just doing shoot counts at the end of the study, it's the same trend. You see that phenoxyprop, the lower bars have better control, meaning less shoots in the plot. And as you can see, phenoxyprop is definitely by far the best option still. And
Acclaim is safe over ornamentals at full rate or quarter rate?
Either. So Acclaim is safe on ornamentals. The question was at full rate or lower rate. Now, Dr. Jeff Durr is our ornamental weed specialist for Virginia Tech, and specific questions should be directed at him, but check the label. But Acclaim, generally speaking, can be sprayed over the top at full rates, even higher than we're allowed to go in ornamental turf grass. You can use higher rates in ornamental beds. Personally, I would direct the spray at the base of plants. Sometimes just the surfactant that's in the herbicide can reduce bloom density or cause a little bit of stunting, but for the most part, no. You can spray this product over the top of your daylilies, irises, liriope, etc., and take out Bermuda grass, crabgrass. You shouldn't really, in my opinion, be hand pulling grasses from ornamental beds when these products are out there. And Acclaim, for example, can be bought in a half-pint container for around $50. So it's even available because of that to homeowners.
so one thing to note real fast on that is that Acclaim, Ornament, Fusilier, Segment, all those are grass-specific herbicides, so they're typically not going to affect your broadleaf herbicide or broadleaf species or other ornamentals you have.
So that benefit becomes a disadvantage if you're trying to target any broadleaf weeds. Yep.
So these are just going to go through a few pictures quickly. Again, of both our studies. 2014 is untreated check. This is mesotron at 2 applications at 4 ounces per acre again.
Tenacity herbicide.
Tenacity, not great control, as you can see, similar to the untreated check. Tepramazone you definitely see a lot more voids, a lot better control than Pilex versus Tenacity. Again, this is 2 applications at a 1/2 ounce per acre. Quinclorac again does curl and cause some necrosis, but doesn't have good control.
And Quinclorac is called Drive, and that is the market-leading post-emergence crabgrass herbicide.
Yeah.
And so the first product that most lawn care operators are going to grab for a grassy problem would probably be Drive, but it does not work on Japanese stiltgrass, as you can see here, and it also does not work on goosegrass or Bermuda grass.
As you can see here, all the Japanese stiltgrass that is left in the plot for the Acclaim is brown and dead, but again, you see it's leaving the broadleaves, which is wild violet, so it's not going to have activity on the broadleaf if you're trying to use this for both grasses and broadleaves in your lawns.
Here's a great time to make one more point about Acclaim. It doesn't get broadleaves, and if you grab a broadleaf herbicide, most of them will antagonize Acclaim. So you take an expensive grass herbicide like a claim, you can take a cheap broadleaf herbicide. If you mix those in the tank together, you'll still kill your broadleaves with broadleaf herbicide, but that broadleaf herbicide will deactivate the acclaim. So you do not want to do that. You want to separate those applications by at least 1 week, preferably 2.
This is the 2015 study, same picture, same. Again, here you see that Tipramazone is a lot more effective. You can see the
did a great
untreated.
job in this year.
You can see the untreated checks with Japanese turfgrass around it, and great application. Again, a claim, great control compared to the untreated check. This next one is go through it quickly. Is a study we did for a company which was looking at last call, which has phenoxyprop, the acclaim active, but also fluroxapyr and dicamba, which are broadleaf herbicides.
2 broadleaf herbicides that were specifically selected because they do not antagonize.
Exactly. And you can see that on your treatment on the left, which is fluroxapyr, phenoxyprop, and dicamba, great control of Japanese turfgrass. You see it when you add in IS. And you also have fluazapop or ornament on the far right, which you were testing for activity. You can see it was slower, but still highly active and controlled Japanese turfgrass well. One note I would like to make here is the treatment there in the middle, quinaclorac, sulfentrazone, 2,4-D plus dicamba, seemed to have great control this year, this year in 2015. But we believe it was a tank contamination, because when I repeated this last year, I didn't show the data, but it was about half of that. It was about like quinaclorac. It was not as active as it shows here. So we think there might have been an issue there in our spraying. It might have been a contamination. So just to know, this is Q4 plus, by the way. Sorry.
Yeah.
So again,
we've looked at Q4 plus again repeatedly. We've looked at the components that make up, and John has never again seen this type of activity on Japanese tiltgrass. So our only conclusion is that there must have been something that contaminated the bottle.
It's typically more active than quinaclorac, but again, not as effective as the others. And this is just showing that study. Last call, you have some regrowth, but still pretty. Oh, this is untreated check. So our untreated check. This is last call again. Great control. This is where we believe we had some contamination between some treatments, because there was a lot of other grass activity that we didn't expect to see.
Right. So Q4 plus should not be harming that fescue. Yeah. A lot of that brown that you see in that image is discolored fescue, and that's just not going to happen from Q4 plus.
Now, and in those situations, if you wanted to do some reseeding, there would be restriction intervals with some of the schemes. Right?
Yes, the most of those hormone herbicides, the broadleaf components, are going to require about a 1 month or at least 3 week restriction. The quinaclorac does not have a restriction on most of the grasses that we would grab in Virginia to seed with. The fluazapop is also going to be 3 weeks to a month.
So this is ornament. Again, you see good activity, but it's injuring and controlling everything. And this 2 weeks out, it's a little slower, but it still has control at the end. Again, the last call here for fluroxapyr, phenoxyprop, dicamba, great control.
Yeah, and the safety there is what we would expect on the fescue as well.
We have a comment about using acclaim and trichopyr for Bermuda grass control with good results.
Yeah, if used in the right time of year, acclaim plus trichopyr or acclaim plus turflawn, or there's other trichopyr product names as well. It's a post-patent generic. Typically, we will start sometime in late August with that program, and it's 3 applications. They are timed 3 weeks apart, and the last application should go out within a couple of weeks of first frost. Sometimes, sometimes most of Virginia is going to require reseeding following one of these programs, and so in the case of a claim turflawn, you would need to have the last application be applied about a month before kind of the tail end of your seeding window, which Dr. Goatley, I would say would range from, let's say, October 1st to say November 1st, depending on where you are in the state. Is that fair?
Further southeast, later you can go.
Yeah.
So we're getting close, running out of time. So we're going to speed through these last couple slides for stiltgrass, because they weren't. This here is just our application timing study. The big thing to note here is that all the herbicides except for acclaim, which is the one red bar that's going up to the top, they all would need second applications to have any kind of successful control for Japanese turfgrass. And also, you see that the herbicides that are applied later in the year have more control. That's due to the fact that Japanese turfgrass did not have time to recover like the first applications did.
I think that's as confusing as it is
Yeah.
to look at. I think it's a great graph to talk about the complexity of Japanese stiltgrass control. Most products are very inconsistent. Acclaim has been consistently consistent.
And so these are just some pictures again showing early versus late. E is early, L is late. The late hasn't been applied yet, but you can see the Pylex activity at 14 days. At 28 days, it's burning it back, suppressing it, but it does have recovery later on. As you can see, the early has almost fully recovered, while the late has even more control than before because it's getting more, we're getting close to fall, so the environment is actually starting to take it out a little bit.
Sometimes those environmental changes in light quality and the day length can change where the plant's pumping things, and that can change where the herbicide goes, and overall effectiveness can be either increased or decreased depending on those changes.
And this is looking at dismiss or sulfentrazone, again, quick burn, but it does have fast recovery and not long-term effect. As you see, both early and late have almost full recovery by the end of the season. But Acclaim early and late stay well controlled throughout the entire season. The late just a little bit slower because it was applied later, but overall great activity from
and look at the floral diversity in those plots.
Yeah.
You've got, now that, again, this could be a bad thing if you don't like weeds, or it's a good thing if you like native plants or you're trying to preserve whatever's there. Now, I say native plants, but most of the time when we've been successful taking out Japanese stiltgrass, what has thrived the most are other invasive species like multiflora rose and Japanese honeysuckle, things like that.
Is there a preferred application process in these LI areas, granule versus foliar and spot versus broadcast treatments?
A preferred, say that again.
Application process in these LI areas, granule versus foliar and spot versus broadcast?
I guess it depends on the scenario. For example, on steep banks where you cannot reach with spray equipment, which is usually ride-on type stuff, granules can be hand strewn without requiring you to go down, onto the cliff. So sometimes granule would be selected for hard to access sites. Generally speaking, though, foliar spray applications are going to give you better weed control and greater chances of seeing undesirable injury to your turf. But selecting the appropriate product that's got that does not injure the turf, the foliar spray is going to be the way to go if you can get it over the site uniformly. Another reason to forego foliar spray in favor of granule would be obstructions like trees. In a lot of these situations, you can't get in with a boom type sprayer if the area is littered with bushes and trees, etc. So that's another reason that granular applications, or we often see our professional lawn care operators using what we call the chem gun, the gun where they spray the wand. That allows them to move in and out of obstructions in the landscape and try to apply these the sprayable chemicals uniformly, despite the inability to have a boom on a ride-on piece of equipment.
This is just, I'm just going back on through so back to the slides. Again, this is sulfentrazone. The biggest thing here, when you even up the high rate of 12 ounce per acre, quick activity at 2 weeks, and then rapid recovery. Same as we've seen all these other products too that have sulfentrazone on the far left. Q4 Plus, the other one's Surge and Solitaire. All three of those, quick activity but quick recovery. Again, 8 float ounces, quick activity, quick recovery. So it's not very effective.
To summarize, Mike Steve, Jim.
Yeah.
Low rates of Acclaim, 7 to 14 ounces, are going to be your most economical and consistent performer. Pylex, if you're using that for other purposes, by all means, go ahead and go treat your Japanese stiltgrass, because it's either going to strongly suppress it or kill it. And to speak to the previous question, I'll make one more comment about granular versus foliar spray. Neither of those particular professional products come in a granular. Yeah. And so many of the granular products that we have available are probably not, other than the pre-emerge products, they're not going to have activity on Japanese stiltgrass.
And one important thing to note that we have not shown here, I know we don't have a lot of time, but one thing that Dr. Askew found was that in some of his studies is low rates, very, very low rates of glyphosate or Roundup are very effective on Japanese stiltgrass and I would potentially be able to use over the top of these areas.
Yeah, you didn't use that because your focus was in managed lawns. But yeah, there are rates actually of glyphosate 3 ounces or less per acre that are labeled to go over the top of turf grass as a plant growth regulator. Now it will discolor your turf grass awfully. So it's great for what we're talking about today, reduced input areas, but not so good for a managed lawn. And boy, we are running out of time.
Yeah.
We've got 7 minutes, so let's get through the blackberry.
So Pennsylvania blackberry is just another very difficult perennial broadleaf to control. A lot of your 3-way-ways will not have activity. It has activity, but will not have long-term control.
3-way being a broadleaf herbicide.
Yes, so 3-way being like Speed Zone, Trimex, some of those herbicides. And here, this is our herbicide control at 6 and 12 weeks after. As you see, Turflawn and Spotlight is triclopyr and fluroxypyr. All the treatments that contained triclopyr, fluroxypyr, active ingredient, typically had our best activity, as you see with these green squares. Metsulfuron and MSM turf is another effective broadleaf herbicide that can be used at fine fescue at a 1/2 ounce per acre. But when you move on to your other combos of like T-Zone, Speed Zone, or Trimac,
these are market leaders in ornamental turf. Whereas this work was done in a reduced management fine fescue area.
They do have quick activity, but long-term they recover and not have long-term control. And this is just some pictures showing that. As you can see, Spotlight and Turflawn again. Any triclopyr containing or fluroxypyr containing herbicide does really well on most broadleaves.
And that American burnweed in the upper right in the Turflawn plot there, it germinated after the treatment had been applied.
Again, you see great Escalade 2 has a 3-way of fluroxypyr, 2,4-D dicamba, I think, or something like that.
Yes.
Very effective. T-Zone has triclopyr, but it's about half the rate as Turflawn ester. So you see the activity, but doesn't have as much strength as the triclopyr, the Turflawn ester. With Speed Zone and Speed Zone having fast activity, quick recovery, and MSM turf, it's a lot slower. The mode of action takes a lot longer for it to have.
And this just showcases, Speed Zone is, if not the market-leading broadleaf herbicide for ornamental turf, it's in the top 3 for sure. Yeah, for cool season managed turf. And notice that it's not controlling this blackberry. So picking the right product can make a big difference depending on.
And this is at 12 weeks, just showing still good control. American burnweed's in the plot, but for blackberry, still great control with your Turflawn and your Spotlight.
And nothing was done here to beef up that grass population. What you were looking for was a grass meadow. After you control the blackberry, you need to come in and seed. You need to possibly look at, get a soil test, look at what fertility-wise might need to be done to try to increase that competitiveness. Otherwise, guess what? You're going to get American burnweed. You're going to get all of these other broadleaves and weedy plants that are going to come in and dominate the site where you killed all that blackberry. And there's
again, Speed Zone like the untreated check, but the Metsulfuron Escalade still looking good. The species of blackberry rubus you're seeing there is actually black raspberry, and in our recent studies, we've seen it's very difficult to control. We have seen activity, pretty good activity with Turflawn when it's sprayed wet, like 1% per volume of the solution, but it's still there.
In which spot are you talking about?
The left, the top left. Escalade 2, you see other.
So it killed the Pennsylvania blackberry, but it did not
I believe the reason you'll see activity here is it was underneath the canopy and came up after application, so that's another reason why.
Yeah, so the Pennsylvania blackberry, which was about waist high when it was sprayed, was covering that black raspberry and the black red, because we have been able to kill the black raspberry to get good coverage.
And this is just shoot counts in the spring to see what kind of regrowth we had. And as you can see, again, triclopyr, fluroxypyr containing products with or without Metsulfuron had great control and reduction in shoots compared to your Speed Zone or non-treated check.
But even as good as those plots look, you can see we're not completely killing everything. Now, some of that could have been creeping in from the edges.
Yeah, and
Our
even
plots were pretty narrow.
And even 2 or 3 years out, I still see activity in those. I can go back to that site, still see
like a hole.
I can still see the hole in the population where it still has not. You see, because a lot of those blackberry species are rhizomatous, so if you don't control the whole population, you're going to have encroachment. And this next slide is looking at fine fescue injury. The only real treatments we saw that had high injury were Metsulfuron at the 1 foot-ounce per acre rate,
which is off-label,
and also the Turflawn plus Metsulfuron, which would not be a recommendation except maybe one application. But if you have multiple applications, you can have severe fine fescue death. by using that combination.
That
But
dotted line there is what we consider commercially acceptable.
Yes.
So they all really fell inside commercial acceptable levels. So move through. Here's actually the fine fescue tolerance site that you did so without all the Blackberry shoulder high, to get in and see what these things are doing to fine fescue, and it wasn't much.
No.
It wasn't
And so our final recommendation, I think, for Blackberry control would be any product that has triclothrin and phylloxera in them would be an effective product to use. Again, I would target Blackberry when it's first germinating in the spring and not wait until they're waist high, because I can promise you, walking through that spring is not fun. You come out more injured than you want to be. But you also need multiple years of application, because you want to, if they keep germinating, you want to make sure you kill them before they are able to reestablish that rooting system. So 2 to 3 years of application would probably be a necessity to have long-term control of Blackberry species.
So we have a lot of raspberry and Blackberry species in some native or reduced management areas that I maintain at my home, and I'll create paths through either with mechanically or with herbicides, and also there's times where they creep out into areas where I don't want them, and I kind of beat them back with a backpack sprayer, and works great. And then I go and pick blackberries sometimes in there.